Every man who wed a Ravenscroft was carried to his grave within a year, the sky above his burial darkened by crows. But the sisters' story did not end in fire, it scattered, carried in bloodlines that may still run through families today. Kentucky in the mid-19th century was a land of contrasts, as wild as it was tamed. The rolling hills folded endlessly into one another, quilted with tobacco rows and hemmed by split-rail fences that creaked with age. Clapboard churches leaned against the wind at the edge of dirt lanes, their white paint already grayed by the smoke of wood stoves and the damp breath of summer storms. Families clung to their farms with calloused hands, shaping the soil into something they hoped would last longer than their own names. Yet there were valleys where the plows never turned, where the church bells never rang, and where the names on people's lips came in whispers instead of greetings. One of those places was Ravenscroft Hollow. It did not appear on any official surveyor's maps, though a few lines of faded ink hinted at its outline in county records. Travelers rarely stumbled into it by accident, and locals claimed the roads bent away from it as if by some unseen hand. If you asked, the old men sitting on courthouse steps in nearby towns would shift in their seats before answering. Some would tell you there was nothing there at all, just a ravine too steep for farming. Others would mutter about a family best left unspoken, their words trailing into the smoke of their pipes. The hollow was less a place than an absence, a space in the land deliberately forgotten. The few who lived close enough to its borders said the air in Ravenscroft Hollow carried a heaviness, like breath caught in the lungs. Birds avoided flying over it. Even in summer, when the fields baked and the grass turned brittle, the hollow remained green and damp, as though it belonged to another season entirely. Livestock that wandered too near grew restless, stamping and snorting until they were driven back. Children were warned never to stray close, not for fear of snakes or wolves, but for reasons their parents could not put into plain words. Ravenscroft Hollow carried a reputation, not written but remembered. Some called it cursed, others called it chosen. It was the sort of place where tragedies piled up quietly, too frequent to be coincidence, yet never spoken of in open company. Outsiders laughed when told the stories, but laughter had a way of souring once night fell, and the hills grew still. The land itself seemed to brood, waiting, as though every tree and stone carried the memory of something that had once happened there, something too heavy for the soil to bury. And so the name lived on, not on maps or deeds, but in the shudder that passed through a room when it was spoken. Ravenscroft Hollow was not just a valley in Kentucky, it was a warning. Elijah Ravenscroft was not the sort of man easily remembered in detail. Neighbors recalled his tall frame and stern brow, the way he carried himself with the authority of someone who had carved his place into the land by sheer force. He was neither warm nor cruel, only distant, as though his eyes were fixed on something beyond the fields he tilled. When he spoke, it was with the clipped weight of scripture, and though few could say they liked him, fewer still dared to cross him. His wife, Margaret, was his mirror in a way that unsettled those who met her. She was not unkind, but her silences lingered longer than any words. People said her presence filled a room the way a shadow does, stretching further than it should, dimming even the laughter of children. Together, they carried an air of inevitability, as though their lives had been written before they were born. The farm they claimed sat at the heart of Ravenscroft Hollow, and it thrived while others struggled. In years when drought cracked the soil and neighbors watched their crops wither to dust, the Ravenscrofts harvested tobacco leaves broad as a man's chest, cornstalks heavy with golden ears. Their livestock grew fat in pastures where other farmers' cattle thinned to bone. Yet with the prosperity came whispers that prosperity was not freely given. Stories spread of calves, born with twisted limbs, their hooves pointing backward, their eyes clouded white as if they had seen something before they drew their first breath. Chickens laid eggs too large for their nests, shells mottled black, yolks the color of rust. Horses were said to bolt without cause, foaming at the mouth until they collapsed, only to rise again days later, calm and obedient as if nothing had happened. The Ravenscrofts buried such matters quietly, but word has a way of slipping through cracks, carried on the tongues of farmhands and midwives who claim to have seen too much. For every tale of deformity, there was another of bounty. Neighbors who traded with Elijah often left uneasy, clutching seeds he promised would take root stronger than their own. Some swore his tobacco cured smoother, his milk richer, his hogs heavier by the pound. Yet no matter how generous the exchange, those who planted Ravenscroft seed sometimes found their own fields failing, as though the land resented the intrusion. It was said that Elijah's soil did not merely feed what was planted in it, it consumed. In church pews, families shifted when the Ravenscrofts entered, offering them polite nods without warmth. To call them respected would be true, but the respect came the way one respects a storm, not out of affection, but out of fear. Elijah and Margaret did not ask for friends, nor did they keep them. They seemed content in their solitude, bound more to their land than to the people around them. And in time, the land returned that devotion in ways no one could explain, ways that some prayed never to understand. The summer of 1847 came heavy and airless in the hollow, the kind of heat that pressed into the lungs and made the nights feel no different from the days. Margaret Ravenscroft had grown pale and swollen, her body carrying the burden of what neighbors believed would be a single child. Elijah kept her hidden from most eyes in those last weeks, saying little, though the way he sharpened his tools long into the night suggested he knew something waited that work alone could not distract him from. When the pains began, the family sent for the midwife, a woman named Eliza Moore who had tended births across the valley for 20 years. She was last seen crossing the ridge with her satchel, a lantern swinging from her hand, the dusk swallowing her figure whole. What happened in that house through the long night was pieced together only by rumor and scraps of memory, but the story has never left the hollow. Margaret did not bring forth a single cry of a child, but 7. 7 wails that rose one after another, weaving into each other until they carried like a chorus across the fields. Neighbors claimed the sound startled their livestock, that dogs howled without pause, that the tobacco leaves themselves seemed to quiver though no wind moved through the valley. By dawn, the Ravenscrofts had 7 daughters swaddled in linen. They were small, yet their eyes opened wide within hours, unblinking, watching the world with a strange focus that unsettled even Elijah. Each bore a faint dark marking along the spine, thin as a feather pressed into the skin. Margaret lay silent, exhausted to the point of collapse, her face gray and damp as though she had given not just her strength, but her very essence. Elijah barred the door to all who came near, announcing the girl's survival with words sharp as iron but offering no invitation to see them. As for the midwife, she was never seen again. Some whispered she fled, horrified by what she witnessed, abandoning her trade entirely. Others claimed she was buried beneath the Ravenscroft soil, her name struck from memory like so many others who crossed too deep into the family's secrets. All that was certain was her satchel, found weeks later at the edge of the creek, its contents scattered, the leather torn as though by claws rather than wear. The birth of 7 daughters on a single night might have been a miracle in another time, a blessing sung from the pulpits. In Ravenscroft Hollow, it became something else. The event was not recorded in the county's ledgers, and no christenings were ever held. The only record was the echo in the hills, 7 voices that had wailed together in the dark, as though announcing not their arrival but the beginning of something the valley would never shake. As the daughters of Ravenscroft Hollow grew, the valley seemed to warp itself around them. At first, they were swaddled infants hidden from view, carried only in Margaret's weary arms or laid together in a long cradle that Elijah himself had fashioned from oak. But even then, those who caught glimpses spoke of the strangeness. 7 tiny faces, each identical as if stamped from the same mold, turned outward in unison when the door creaked or the lantern swung. Their cries did not overlap like most children's but rose in harmony, falling into the same pitch as if their voices knew one another before they had breath. By the time they could walk, The likeness between them unsettled even those who tried to love them. Their hair, black as crow feathers, fell straight against pale skin, and their eyes dark, watchful, wide carried a weight that no child should know. Yet, for all their sameness, each gaze seemed to hold something slightly apart, as though 7 different fates had been crammed into one body and split only at the last moment. One daughter's stare was sharp and restless, another's heavy with quiet sadness. A third's eyes gleamed with mischief, though her lips rarely bent into a smile. The others carried shades of solemnity, hunger, or distance that gave them each a presence distinct, yet inseparable. Across their spines ran faint markings, visible only when summer heat forced them into lighter shifts. Long black streaks, soft as shadows, stretched from shoulder to hip like feathers pressed into flesh. Margaret sewed high collars and buttoned backs for them as soon as their forms allowed, but secrets never stay hidden in a valley as watchful as Ravenscroft Hollow. Neighbors whispered about the marks. Some said they were stains of the devil's hand. Others swore they were proof the girls belonged not to man, but to the land itself, the hollow marking what was its own. The name blackbirds took root, whispered at church gatherings and scrawled on barn doors in crude chalk. Farmers muttered it when they saw the sisters moving together across the fields, their small white dresses catching the light like a flock of doves, until one looked closer and saw their black hair gleam, their shadows merge. Children were told to stay away, though curiosity sometimes lured them to the fence lines where the 7 played. Those who lingered claimed the sisters never truly played at all. They stood in circles, hands clasped, murmuring songs no one else recognized, their voices weaving in eerie harmony with the caws of the crows that gathered in the trees above. Identical in face, divided in gaze, marked in flesh, the 7 daughters grew into something the valley could not name but could not ignore. To the people of Kentucky, they were Ravenscrofts. To the Hollow, they were its children. But to everyone else, they were the blackbirds, and the sound of their voices drifting across the fields was less like laughter than the warning of wings. On a damp spring morning, Elijah Ravenscroft carried his 7 daughters down the dirt road toward the clapboard church that perched above the valley. The bell tower leaned slightly, its rusted tongue unmoved in years, yet the building remained the center of life for every family within reach of its sermons. Margaret walked behind, her shawl pulled tight, her face pale from months of sleeplessness. Neighbors gathered at the sight, their conversations faltering as the Ravenscrofts approached. They had waited for this moment, to see if the family would at last bring their strange brood into the fold of the congregation. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and damp hymnals. Pastor Hale, a man known for his booming voice and his strict interpretation of Scripture, stood rigid at the pulpit. He was not a timid soul, yet even he faltered as Elijah ushered the daughters forward. The 7 little girls sat in the front pew in perfect stillness, their identical faces turned upward, eyes dark and unblinking. They did not fidget, did not whisper, did not cling to their mother's skirts like children were wont to do. They watched the pastor as though they had been waiting for him. Elijah requested baptism, in a voice low but firm. Pastor Hale cleared his throat, his hand lingering on the Bible as though it might give him strength. He spoke of God's timing, of divine order, of children born into his hour, but his words stumbled when his gaze fell upon the sisters, sitting so still they seemed carved from wax. He did not step toward the font. Instead, he closed the book before him and shook his head. His refusal was quiet, almost trembling, but it rang louder in the silence than any sermon he had preached. Whispers carried quickly. "Not born of God's hour," someone muttered from the back. "7 in one night," another replied. "That's not his work." Mothers clutched their children closer, as though proximity alone might taint them. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Margaret lowered her eyes, her hands gripping the pew until her knuckles whitened. When the congregation book was updated that week, the Ravenscroft daughters' names were absent. Lines of ink recorded births and baptisms across the county, But in the place where 7 should have been written, the page skipped forward without a mark. It was as though they had never entered the church at all. From that day, the girls stood outside the circle of worship. Families crossed the road to avoid them, and their footsteps in the churchyard were no longer welcome. The silence of that refusal became a scar on the valley, one that deepened with each passing year. In Ravenscroft Hollow, faith was supposed to bind a community. Instead, it drew a line the daughters could never cross, branding them as something other, something not meant for God's house, nor God's time. The 7 sisters of Ravenscroft Hollow did not walk the same paths as other children. When the school bell rang in the nearest town, summoning boys and girls to their wooden desks, the Ravenscroft daughters remained behind, their lessons taught at home by Margaret in the dim light of the farmhouse. No one could say for certain whether they learned their letters or their sums, for their books were never borrowed from the church library and their slates never carried into town. What neighbors did see was the girls together, always together, moving as though bound by an invisible cord that kept one from drifting too far from the others. They rarely spoke when in sight of strangers. In the marketplace, if Elijah brought them along, they would stand shoulder to shoulder at the cart's edge, their black eyes sweeping across the stalls without a word. When addressed directly, they sometimes turned their faces in unison toward the speaker, but left the answering to Elijah or Margaret. People came to expect no replies, only that strange silence broken by the shuffle of their matching shoes across the dirt. More than once, farmers returning from the fields swore they saw the sisters standing in open meadows, their necks bent back as they stared at the sky for hours at a time. They were not watching birds, nor clouds, nor the shifting patterns of weather. Their gaze was fixed higher, deeper, as though they searched for something beyond sight. On evenings when the moon hung low, they walked in circles across the pasture grass, hands linked, their steps measured and slow. To onlookers, it resembled a dance, but one without music, without joy, the rhythm carrying a weight that made even the wind hesitate before crossing their path. Children from neighboring farms dared each other to creep close, to spy on the blackbirds as they came to be called. Those who managed it spoke in hushed tones afterward of voices rising, not in laughter but in humming, 7 notes blending together into chords that didn't sound quite right, as though their harmony came from a place older than song. Some claimed the sound followed them home, whispering at the edges of their sleep. Parents forbade their children from venturing near again. As the sisters grew, their sameness became more striking. They moved with the same posture, carried the same tilt of the head, often turned corners at the exact same moment. Yet in their eyes there flickered subtle differences, an edge of longing in one, a simmering defiance in another, but these glimpses vanished as quickly as they appeared. To the people of the valley, they were not 7 individuals, but a single presence split into 7 bodies, bound by something that no schooling, no church, and no neighbor could ever untangle. In Ravenscroft Hollow, childhood was meant to be a season of noise and mischief. For the 7 daughters, it was silence, symmetry, and a gaze fixed far beyond the horizon. The Ravenscroft farm stood apart from all others, not for its size or the skill of its workers, but for the way the land seemed to answer only to the family who claimed it. Year after year, when neighboring farms wrestled with drought or rot, Elijah's fields swelled with life. The tobacco leaves rose broad and heavy, thick enough that one could hold them up like a banner against the Sunday. Corn stalks towered head-high before midsummer, their ears fat with kernels long before harvest season should have come. Even the soil itself, dark and damp beneath the boot, seemed richer than the clay-red dirt found just a mile down the road. Men from other farms visited out of curiosity, standing at the fence line to watch the sisters moving slowly through the rows, their pale dresses drifting between the green stalks. The girls carried baskets to gather herbs, their hands brushing the leaves as if in blessing. Whatever touched their fingers seemed to flourish. A tobacco plant bent low at their passing, almost bowing, then straightened taller and stronger than before. It was said more than once that the sisters did not weed the fields, for no weeds dared to grow where they walked. Such plenty came at a cost beyond sight. Around the hollow, sickness began to ripple through the valley. Cattle in neighboring pastures staggered and fell, their ribs showing even when the grass lay thick. Hogs wasted to bone, though their troughs remained full. Crops browned and shriveled in fields that had once been steady and fertile. Families muttered prayers as they buried livestock, their barns silent, save for the cough of children, who soon followed the same wasting sickness. Yet the Ravenscroft Hollow knew no such affliction. Their cattle grew fat, their pigs squealed with healthy weight, their crops shimmered with dew even on mornings when the neighbors' fields lay brittle and gray. Families desperate for relief begged Elijah for seed, for a cutting of his tobacco, a scoop of soil from his blessed land. Some claimed he gave it, though never freely. Others said he refused, his stern face unmoved by their pleading. Whatever left his farm never thrived in another man's ground. The divide grew sharp. In church, families whispered that the Ravenscrofts had made a bargain. Others spoke of curses, that their bounty was bought with the hunger of those around them. No one could prove it, but every empty field and every shallow grave seemed to point back to the same place, the lush green acres of Ravenscroft Hollow, where sickness did not tread, and where 7 silent daughters moved like shadows among leaves too large, too perfect, to be natural. The summer of Elijah Ravenscroft's 40th year began like all the others before it, with the fields around the hollow bending under their unnatural weight. Neighbors said they saw him that morning, striding the rows with his broad hat pulled low, his hands clasped behind his back as though inspecting the plants for flaws no one else could see. The air was heavy with heat, the kind that pressed sweat into every crease of the body, yet Elijah moved with the same rigid purpose he always carried. He did not complain, did not slow, did not call for water. By midday, the man who had seemed carved from the very stone of the valley fell face first into the soil that had always obeyed him. No one witnessed the moment of his collapse, though the story spread quickly that crows were the first to notice. By the time a farmhand found him lying among the tobacco, his lifeless body was ringed by a black cloud of wings. They pecked and tore with fevered hunger, scattering only when the hand shouted and flung his cap into the air. What was left of Elijah's face bore no dignity. His eyes were gone, the sockets ragged and empty, the flesh around them raw from the bird's frenzy. The news spread through the valley with a shiver. Some men said it was the natural end of a hard life in the fields, that even the strongest body must eventually bend. But others whispered darker things. They said Elijah had been claimed, that the land which had given him so much had finally taken its due. The crows, so often seen circling the Ravenscroft fields, were not scavengers but servants, drawn to the moment their master's spirit left his body. When the farmhand carried the news to the house, the 7 daughters stood together in the doorway. They did not cry, nor rush forward with the helpless panic of children who had lost their father. Instead, they turned their dark eyes toward the fields where his body still lay and remained silent. Margaret stood behind them, her hands resting heavily on their shoulders. No tears stained her cheeks either. The burial was swift, attended only by a handful of neighbors who came out of obligation more than sympathy. The crows gathered in the trees that lined the hollow, hundreds of them, their calls echoing through the service until Pastor Hale abandoned his words entirely. When the earth closed over Elijah's coffin, the sisters did not weep. They stood in perfect stillness, their faces calm, their hands linked. It seemed to those watching that they were not mourning a loss at all, but watching a chapter close in a story they already knew the ending to. After Elijah's burial, the hollow grew quieter, but it was not the silence of grief. It was the kind of quiet that clings after a storm has passed, when the air is still charged, but waiting for what comes next. Margaret Ravenscroft, once a woman of sharp posture and steady hands, began to fade before the eyes of those few who saw her. Her cheeks hollowed, her skin turned the pale gray of ash, and her steps slowed as if each one pulled more from her than she had to give. Yet in that decline, she seemed more devoted than ever to her daughters. At dusk, when most families shuttered their windows and drew the curtains, lantern light still flickered across the Ravenscroft fields. Neighbors who lived near the ridge swore they saw Margaret walking among the rows with the 7 daughters close behind, each child holding a lantern. From a distance, the lights drifted into strange formations, circles, spirals, even shapes that mirrored the stars above. One farmer, returning late from town, paused on the road and claimed the lanterns formed a perfect constellation, brighter than the sky itself. The daughters stood still in the tobacco rows, their arms lifted high, while Margaret's voice carried faintly through the night, low and measured, as though she spoke to someone other than her children. By morning, the fields bore no trace of the gathering, save for the uncanny sheen of the leaves and the feeling in the air, thick and heavy, as if the ground itself had been fed. The Ravenscroft crops grew taller, their stalks stiff and dark, while Margaret herself grew thinner, her back bowing, her hair whitening faster than the years allowed. Those who saw her in daylight whispered that she looked like a candle burning at both ends, her life spilling away even as her children thrived. Rumors turned sharper. Some said Margaret had struck a bargain, that her vitality was the tithe demanded so her daughters might flourish. Others insisted it was not bargain but choice, that she willingly poured her strength into them, letting her body wither so their lives would burn brighter. More than once, a phrase was whispered in kitchens and churchyards. She gave them her strength. The words carried not pity but unease, as though the act itself was unnatural. A mother not just raising children but offering herself piece by piece. When Margaret walked through town, her figure wrapped in a shawl too large for her dwindling frame, the daughters flanking her in silence, no one dared to speak. Her eyes burned with a strange clarity, even as her body wasted. It was as though she had already passed something of herself into the 7 blackbirds, leaving only the husk of a woman behind, tethered to the earth until her final breath gave the last of what she had promised. The first disappearance was written off as mischief. A boy of 9, known for wandering farther than he ought, failed to return from a morning spent fishing along the creek. His pole was found wedged in the mud, the line still bobbing in the current, but no sign of the boy ever surfaced. His parents scoured the banks until dusk, calling his name until their voices broke. When the sun set and no answer came, neighbors whispered the word Ravenscroft under their breath, though none dared say it aloud to the grieving mother. Weeks later, a second child vanished, a girl who had been picking berries with her cousins near the ridge. Her cousins claimed she saw something in the trees and drifted away, smiling as though beckoned. They swore they heard other voices, soft and singing, though no one else was there. When they tried to follow, they found only the woods, the air still and watching. The girl's basket lay overturned in the grass. The berries spilled like drops of blood across the soil. By the time the third child disappeared, the rumors had hardened into certainty. Children spoke in frightened tones of 7 figures in white dresses glimpsed at the edges of the woods. They said the Ravenscroft sisters would stand just beyond the tree line, faces pale, their dark eyes unblinking, until one of the local children stepped closer. Then they would turn together, silent, and walk deeper into the forest. Those who followed never returned. The survivors described it the same each time. The girls never spoke, never touched, only drifted ahead like shadows dressed in white. Their movements so fluid it was hard to tell if their feet touched the earth at all. Parents barred their doors at night and forbade their children from venturing anywhere near the hollow, but curiosity has a way of gnawing at the young. Some children claimed they heard humming carried on the wind, 7 voices blending together, sweet and soft like lullabies. The sound would draw them to the fence lines, their hearts quickening with both fear and longing, until they caught sight of the pale figures waiting at the edge of the woods. Search parties combed the forest with lanterns and dogs, but the trail always dissolved into nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle. Only the quiet, heavy air of the hollow and the uneasy caw of crows circling above. In time, families stopped speaking of it openly. They buried empty coffins, carved names into stone without bodies beneath, and avoided the Ravenscroft farm altogether. Yet the whispers carried on, that the 7 blackbirds had called, and the children had answered, stepping willingly into a darkness that belonged to no season and no god. He arrived without warning, riding into the county on a mule too thin for the burden it carried. His name was never certain. Some remembered him as Reverend Carter, others swore he gave the name Williams, but all agreed on the impression he left. A tall man, sun-scorched and narrow-eyed, with a Bible clutched so tightly in his hand the leather seemed an extension of his skin. His voice carried like a whip crack, sharp and unyielding, and he wasted no time making his mission plain. The Ravenscrofts, he declared, were unnatural. Their children were not of God, and the land they walked upon was cursed. At first, his arrival stirred a kind of relief among the townsfolk. Few had dared to speak so openly, though the whispers had been thick for years. In the churchyard, he thundered from the pulpit with words that made mothers clutch their children tighter and fathers nod grimly in agreement. 7 born in one night, he roared, marked like carrion, silent as the grave. Do you not see what festers among you? The Lord tests his flock, and your silence has made you complicit. For 3 nights he preached in the open air, lantern light flickering across his gaunt features as if he were carved from fire itself. He demanded the Ravenscrofts be driven out, cast from the county before their rot spread further. Some say he rallied men to gather arms, to march into the Hollow and tear the family from their home. Others claimed he was less a preacher than a zealot, hungry for spectacle, hoping to carve his name into the county's history by cleansing it with blood. Yet for all his fire, the people hesitated. Fear held them back, the same fear that had kept them from acting for years. They listened, they nodded, but when the time came to march, they lingered in their kitchens and barns, unwilling to step across the boundary of the Hollow. The Ravenscrofts were not to be approached, not even by a man who spoke with the certainty of heaven behind him. On the 7th night, his voice fell silent. His mule was found tethered to a post outside the inn. Its saddle still waited with his satchel. The Bible he had carried was discovered in the grass near the edge of Ravenscroft Hollow, pages torn as if ripped by frantic hands. But of the preacher himself, there was no trace. No body, no footprints, not even a scrap of cloth. The search lasted only a day before men abandoned it, unwilling to follow his path into the woods. Whispers soon replaced the memory of his sermons. Some said the sisters had met him at the edge of the fields, their white dresses glowing in the lantern light, and that he followed them into the dark, as so many others had. Others believed the land itself swallowed him whole, his voice too loud, too insistent, for a place that demanded silence. Whatever the truth, his warning lingered only in rumor, while the man himself was erased as swiftly as he had appeared. By the time the Ravenscroft daughters reached 17, the Hollow could no longer contain the strangeness of their presence. They had grown into women whose beauty was undeniable, yet it was the kind of beauty that unsettled more than it charmed. Their faces, still identical, seemed almost sculpted, their black hair falling to their waists, their pale eyes catching light in ways that left those who looked too long unsettled. To see one of them was arresting. To see all 7 together was overwhelming, like encountering a vision too carefully arranged to belong to nature. They moved through the valley as though tethered, their steps measured, their pace matched so precisely that onlookers swore their skirts brushed the ground in unison. Silence followed them everywhere. They never shouted across a field, never called to one another in the playful voices expected of girls their age. Instead, they turned their heads together, lifted their hands together, and when they paused, it was as if time itself had bent to accommodate their stillness. Farmers mending fences would find themselves halting their work, realizing only after long minutes that they had been staring, unable to look away. In town, the fascination grew sharper, laced with fear. Young men whispered about the sisters in the corners of taverns, speaking of their beauty in tones half reverent, half afraid. More than one admitted to dreams where the daughters appeared in their white dresses, circling them slowly, their eyes fixed and unblinking. Some dreams carried sweetness, the sisters beckoning with gentle hands. Others turned darker men waking drenched in sweat, certain they had been followed by shadows, their names whispered in voices that overlapped until they were indistinguishable from the cawing of birds. One boy, son of a wealthy farmer, confessed in a drunken haze that he had followed them into the woods late one evening, hoping to catch one alone. He claimed he lost hours there, the sisters leading him deeper with every step. When he finally stumbled home at dawn, his boots were wet, his clothes torn by bramble, and his eyes wide with terror. He swore he had never been touched, yet he felt marked all the same, as though something had been taken from him in that silent procession. His family sent him away within the month, saying he had fallen into madness. The fascination did not fade with distance. Letters, written by traveling men, spoke of visions that lingered long after they left the valley. They dreamed of 7 pale faces framed by night, 7 pairs of eyes that bore into them across miles. The Ravenscroft daughters did not need to speak to be remembered. Their silence, their shadowed movements, and the dreams they left behind were enough to hold every man in the county within their grasp. To desire them was to fear them, and to fear them was to never escape them. The first time the neighbors spoke of it was on a windless night when the fields lay still and every sound carried farther than it should have. From the ridge above Ravenscroft Hollow came a murmur, faint at first, as though drifting from the earth itself. Those who paused to listen swore it was no ordinary hymn or prayer. It was 7 voices, rising and falling in unison, each thread distinct, yet so perfectly entwined that together they became something greater, something that did not sound wholly human. The chanting continued for hours, seeping into the valley like mist. Farmers lying awake in their beds felt the rhythm in their chests, a thrum that echoed their heartbeats until they could no longer tell which was their own. Livestock shifted restlessly in their stalls, snorting and kicking as though unsettled by an unseen predator. Even the dogs, loyal to their masters, refused to leave their porches, their ears flat, their eyes fixed toward the hollow with low whines. Above it all came the birds. Crows by the dozens, then hundreds, poured into the sky, drawn as if summoned. Their black wings beat against the air, blotting out the pale light of the moon. Some circled endlessly over the farmstead, while others settled in the trees, their branches sagging under the weight. Witnesses described the sound as deafening the croak and caw of thousands of throats mingling with the 7 voices below, until the night itself seemed to split open with noise. Neighbors dared not step closer, but they could not turn away either. From their distance, they glimpsed lanterns moving across the Ravenscroft fields, weaving into patterns that mirrored constellations overhead. The 7 sisters walked in circles, their pale dresses luminous against the dark earth, while their voices carried a cadence that grew sharper, more commanding, as though they were speaking not to one another but to something vast that answered only to them. Then, without warning, the chanting ceased. Silence slammed down over the valley so thick it left men gasping, as though sound itself had been stolen. The birds scattered in one great surge, their wings tearing against the air, leaving only black feathers drifting down to carpet the fields. By dawn, the farm looked untouched, the tobacco leaves glistening with dew, the soil as calm as ever. Yet those who had heard it could not shake the certainty that something had been promised in the night, some vow spoken between sisters and the darkness that gathered above them. The phrase began to spread quietly in kitchens and barns. The Ravenscrofts had taken a blood oath. No one knew its terms, but all agreed on one thing: the valley had changed, and the sky itself had borne witness. It began on a dry autumn night, when the harvest lay stacked in barns and the hills smelled of smoke from burning leaves. No storm had passed, no lightning split the sky, and yet flames erupted from the Miller farmhouse as if sparked from within. The fire rose quick and merciless, chewing through timber and shingles before a single bucket could be thrown. Families rushed from their beds to form a line at the well, but the blaze moved faster than their hands. The roof collapsed with a groan that shook the ground, and sparks leapt high enough to catch in the branches of nearby trees. Inside, voices screamed, and then fell silent. Only 3 of the Millers stumbled out into the night, the mother clutching her youngest, the eldest son dragging his father half-conscious into the yard. They were blackened with soot, their eyes wild, their words stumbling over one another as they pointed to the fields beyond the flames. They swore, through gasps and sobs, that they were not alone. Across the tree line, 7 figures stood in perfect stillness. White dresses glowed against the dark, their hems unmoving in the wind stirred by the fire. The Ravenscroft sisters, unmistakable even in shadow, watched the blaze without a word. Their faces caught the red light, their dark eyes reflecting it back until they seemed like coals smoldering in sockets too calm for the chaos before them. None of them lifted a hand, none cried out, none made any move to help as the farmhouse crumbled to ash. Those who fought the fire swore that the sisters' presence made their arms heavy, their buckets slower. It was as though the weight of the watchers at the tree line dulled every effort. More than once, men dropped their pails and shivered, certain they heard humming beneath the roar of the flames, a low and steady tone that matched the crackle of burning wood. The survivors of the Miller family fell to their knees, pointing again and again toward the girls. But when the fire finally died and the crowd turned to face the woods, the sisters were gone. Only black feathers drifted in the grass where they had stood. By morning, the Miller homestead was nothing but a smoking foundation. No cause was ever found, no spark explained. Yet the story grew quickly, repeated in whispers that grew sharper with each telling. The Ravenscrofts had called the fire. They had watched as it devoured walls and lives alike, their faces painted by its glow as though in worship. From that night onward, the valley carried not just fear of the 7 daughters, but the conviction that they did not simply walk beside disaster, they beckoned it. The winter Margaret Ravenscroft died was one of the coldest the Hollow had known. Frost clung to the tobacco stubble long after the sun rose, and the creek froze so solid children could walk across it without fear of breaking through. Yet inside the Ravenscroft house, the air was stifling, heavy with the smell of herbs burned in clay bowls and the silence of daughters who rarely left their mother's side. Neighbors saw less and less of Margaret that season, and when she did appear, she moved like a shadow already half faded, her shawl wrapped tight around a frame that had dwindled to bone. When news of her death spread, it came without warning. No one had heard her cry out, no one summoned a doctor or pastor. The story was carried by a farmhand who had ventured close enough to hear the wails of the 7 daughters rising together, not in grief but in something harsher, sharper, like a lament sung in a language older than words. By the time the neighbors gathered the courage to visit, Margaret's body was already laid out in the front room. What they saw there ensured the story of her end would never fade. Her face bore no wound, her body no sign of struggle. Yet from her skin sprouted black feathers, pressed flat against her arms, her chest, even her throat. They clung to her like a second skin, delicate yet unyielding, as if they had grown from her flesh rather than settled upon it. The house was locked, the shutters drawn tight, and not a single bird was found within. Still, the feathers covered her like a burial shroud, gleaming in the firelight as though alive. When Pastor Hale offered to oversee the burial, the daughters refused him with a silence more forceful than words. They barred the doors against neighbors, against prayers, against ritual. Instead, the 7 of them carried their mother's body into the frozen ground themselves. Witnesses from a distance described the sight, the daughters moving as one, their white dresses stark against the snow, lowering the coffin into a pit they had dug with their own hands. No hymns were sung, no scripture read. Only the rhythmic scrape of shovels filled the hollow until Margaret Ravenscroft was swallowed by earth. When the grave was filled, the sisters stood hand in hand around it, their dark eyes lifted to the sky. Crows circled overhead, though none had been seen in the hollow for weeks, their cries echoing against the barren hills. The sisters did not weep, they did not speak. They left the mound of earth unmarked, no stone, no name, only a scattering of black feathers pressed into the snow by the wind. From that day forward, the valley understood. Whatever Margaret had given her daughters in life, she had surrendered the last of herself in death. The hollow belonged to them now. After Margaret's burial, the 7 daughters stood taller in the hollow, their presence no longer tempered by the figure of their mother. They were young women now, striking in their pale beauty, and though fear still clung to their name, fascination soon overcame caution. One by one, men from the county began to circle the Ravenscroft farm, their eyes drawn by something they could not explain. Some came from ambition, believing marriage into the family would bring them wealth from fertile land. Others came from desire, whispering of the sisters' strange allure, their silence heavy with promises unspoken. Whatever their reasons, each man found himself unable to turn away once his gaze had lingered too long. The first wedding was a hushed affair, held in a church where half the congregation refused to attend. The bride walked the aisle with her 6 sisters behind her, their dresses white as bone, their steps perfectly in time. The groom's hands trembled as he took his vows, though no one could say if it was from joy or dread. For a season, the couple seemed unremarkable, working the land together, appearing in town on occasion. But before the year turned, the man was found in his bed, pale and lifeless, his chest bruised black, as though crows had trampled him in his sleep. The pattern repeated with the next marriage, and then the next. Each groom entered the union with uneasy smiles and left the world within 12 months, carried to his grave by neighbors who refused to speak the Ravenscroft name. The burials became their own ritual. Each time, as the coffin was lowered, the sky darkened with flocks of crows so dense they blotted out the Sunday. The birds circled and cried until the last shovelful of dirt was thrown, then vanished as swiftly as they had come, leaving behind only silence and the uneasy knowledge that the cycle was beginning again. Some families tried to intervene, warning their sons away, whispering that to wed a Ravenscroft was to invite death into the home, yet warnings proved useless. The sisters never courted openly, but when a man's eyes met theirs, he seemed bound, compelled to follow through no matter the risk. Each believed, perhaps foolishly, that his fate would be different, that love or luck or prayer might break the pattern. But the hollow does not bend to hope. By the time the 6th daughter's husband was buried, the county had stopped asking questions. The marriages continued, and the funerals followed, each one marked by the thunder of wings above and the grim acceptance below. The Ravenscroft name grew heavier with each grave, not just a family but a curse that men willingly walked into, knowing they would not walk back out. It began quietly, as most erasures do. A clerk in the county courthouse opened the great leather-bound book of births one morning and found an entire page missing. The tear was clean, deliberate, the edges frayed as though wrenched out by impatient hands. At first, it was dismissed as accident or mischief, but soon more gaps appeared. Names that should have marked the passage of children into the world were gone, leaving only blank spaces where ink had once fixed their existence in time. Strangely, the missing pages all shared one thread. They touched the Ravenscrofts, either directly or through families bound to them by marriage. Marriage ledgers suffered the same fate. A groom's name might remain, but the line where his bride should have been recorded lay smudged or absent altogether, as though the very ink refused to hold her presence. In some volumes, whole sections had been cut free, leaving ragged scars in the county's memory. Land deeds fared no better. Parcels once listed under families tied to the Ravenscrofts appeared struck through, dates rewritten, ownership transferred to hands that no one remembered signing. The clerks muttered about vandals or mistakes, but the pattern grew too precise to ignore. It was not carelessness, it was removal. The families themselves seemed to sense the change. Men whose brothers had wed Ravenscroft daughters found their barns burned under clear skies, their wells souring without cause. Mothers whispered of children who sickened suddenly, their fevers rising with no cure until the family packed their belongings and fled the valley altogether. Neighbors who had lived for generations upon the same acre sold their land in haste, the ink still wet on the contracts as they loaded wagons and turned their backs on the hollow. They did not look behind them, not even when the crows gathered on fence posts watching them go. Soon, the courthouse shelves stood full of ledgers heavy with gaps, the official history of the county fractured like glass. Future generations would find no trace of certain names, no record that some marriages had ever occurred or that some children had ever been born. It was as though the hollow itself reached into the records, plucking out what tied others to the Ravenscrofts, leaving silence in its place. By the end of that decade, whole family lines had vanished from Kentucky soil. Some believed they had been driven out by fear. Others swore the erasures were not only clerical but spiritual, that the curse did not merely touch lives but consumed memory itself. And so the Ravenscroft name remained, heavy and immovable, while those tethered to it dissolved, their histories scattered like ash in the wind. Annabeth Ravenscroft was the youngest of the seven, though to most eyes she was indistinguishable from her sisters. Her face bore the same pale symmetry, her hair the same raven darkness, her movements the same measured grace that made the sisters seem less like individuals than reflections of a single presence. Yet those who paid close attention insisted there was something different about her, a quiet fracture in the mirror. While her sisters walked in silence, Annabeth sometimes lingered behind, her gaze drifting not to the soil or the sky, but to the people who watched from a distance. And when she spoke on the rare occasions she allowed words to pass her lips, the sound unsettled even those accustomed to the Ravenscroft strangeness. Her voice was not her own. It carried tones too layered for a single throat, a low resonance beneath her words as though another spoke alongside her. Once, a neighbor swore he heard her murmur a greeting, but the sound that followed was older, heavier, not English, and not meant for human ears. Children who crossed her path fled at the sound, their hair rising as if a cold wind had passed through them. Even her sisters seemed altered in her presence. When Annabeth spoke, the others turned their faces toward her, not with sisterly fondness but with something like deference, as if her voice carried weight beyond blood. Unlike her siblings, Annabeth never married. Suitors came, drawn by the same beauty that had lured others into graves, but each left quickly, unsettled by her stillness and the strange echo of her words. It was whispered she laughed at one who offered his hand, though no one who heard it called the sound laughter. Instead, they described it as a hollow chime, the ring of glass struck in a dark room. By the time she reached her 21st year, the county had resigned itself to the certainty that Annabeth would never leave Ravenscroft Hollow. Then she vanished. One morning, her bed lay empty, her white dress folded neatly on the chair beside it. No tracks led from the farmhouse, no door had been opened, no window unlatched. Her sisters offered no explanation, their silence heavier than denial. In the corner of her room stood a cradle, blackened as though fire had licked across its wood, though no flame had touched the house. Inside, feathers lay thick as ash, pressed into the lining as though something had been cradled there, something no one dared name. The cradle was carried from the house and buried in the frozen soil, but neighbors whispered the act was pointless. Annabeth had not been taken, they said. She had crossed some threshold only the Ravenscrofts could see, leaving behind the faint trace of wings. From that day forward, the valley spoke her name rarely, and when they did, it was with unease. For Annabeth Ravenscroft was not lost. She had simply gone where the rest would one day follow. The end of the Ravenscroft farm came on a night of thunderless fire. The county clerk recorded it as lightning, a strike from a storm that never reached the valley, a natural misfortune that consumed wood and crop alike. But those who stood on the ridges overlooking the hollow told another story, one that never made its way into official reports. They swore the sky was clear, the stars sharp and unbroken, when the first glow rose from the Ravenscroft fields. What began as a faint shimmer became a blaze so fierce it painted the hillsides red, casting shadows miles away. Neighbors rushed to the scene but found the air itself pushing them back, a heat too thick to penetrate. From a distance they watched, helpless, as the farmhouse collapsed inward, the barns folded to cinders, the earth itself seeming to writhe beneath the weight of the fire. Yet what they remembered most were the shapes moving within the flames. 7 figures stood tall in the inferno, their white dresses untouched by ash, their hair lifting in the updraft like black banners. They did not flail or scream as mortals do when caught by fire. Instead, their mouths opened in song. The sound carried across the valley, unearthly and layered, 7 voices weaving into one that rose higher than the crackle of burning wood. Some witnesses fell to their knees, certain they were hearing not a song but a summoning, a hymn to something that answered from the dark sky above. Others pressed their hands over their ears, unable to bear the weight of the harmony. Still, no one could look away. The sisters' faces glowed red, their eyes reflecting the blaze until they seemed to shine with their own inner fire. When at last the flames collapsed into embers, silence settled like a shroud. The farm was gone, reduced to blackened earth and smoldering beams. No bodies were found in the ruins, no bones, no ash that could be claimed as theirs. The sisters had been seen in the heart of the fire, singing as the world crumbled around them, and then they were gone. Whether they burned or vanished into the song itself, no one could say. In the days that followed, officials marked the tragedy as an act of God, an unlucky strike that spared no soul. But those who had watched with their own eyes carried a different certainty. The Ravenscrofts had not been destroyed. They had erased themselves, carrying their legacy into flame and leaving behind only scorched soil where nothing grew again. For years afterward, travelers spoke of the hollow's silence, the way crows avoided its charred remains, and the way, on still nights, a faint chorus seemed to drift from the ashes, a reminder that the 7 daughters had not died, they had been claimed. The hollow lies empty now. The fields where tobacco once grew in unnatural abundance are overgrown with thickets, and the creek, once said to run colder than the rest, trickles through moss and stone without drawing a single visitor to its banks. No Ravenscroft name is found on a mailbox or carved into a gate. Their farm is gone, their graves unmarked, their house nothing more than a rumor carried on the wind. Officially, they are extinct in Kentucky. The ledgers in the courthouse show no children born to them after the fire, no descendants to inherit the land. Yet the absence itself feels too deliberate, as though the hollow has been scrubbed clean not by time, but by intent. And still, their blood did not vanish. For every record torn away, others remained, scattered across the country in places far from the hollow. Genealogists digging through faded archives find threads leading outward. Marriages listed under other surnames, children born in towns hundreds of miles away, their mothers' maiden names absent from the record, but hinted at in letters, in obituaries, in whispers. In Tennessee, a girl born with a streak of feathers along her spine. In Ohio, a boy who swore he heard voices when no one else was near. In Missouri, a family whose farm prospered while their neighbors' fields withered to dust. The traces are faint but unmistakable. The blackbirds followed. Wherever the bloodlines spread, so too did the stories. Strange births, uncanny harvests, children who sang in their sleep with voices that seemed layered, as though joined by others no one could see. Families moved again and again, carrying the name under different guises, yet leaving behind neighbors who whispered of blessings too heavy, of curses too deep. Some descendants tried to bury it, to change their names, to hide their origins. Others embraced it, wearing their strangeness like armor, though they never spoke aloud the word Ravenscroft. Today, historians call it folklore, a tale stitched together from fragments of record and memory. But in the quiet corners of America, where family Bibles still hold secrets and attics keep letters never meant to be read, the threads remain. A photograph with 7 blurred figures at the edge. A diary entry describing a dream of women in white, a cradle kept in a cellar, its lining blackened with feathers. The Ravenscrofts no longer walk the hollow, but their shadow never left. It stretched outward, seeping into the veins of the country, carried by blood and bone. And if you trace far enough back, past the names you know, past the stories your family tells, you may find yourself staring into the same silence the valley once knew. Perhaps you'll discover that your line, too, passes through them. And if that is true, then the blackbirds have already found you.